Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fuck up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
Hello, occultists. I am Richard Bigley, and by remote conference with me, I have...
Sage Murray!
Ood Gallifrey.
And guest host...
Arthur Dallas.
Alrighty, what are we covering today?
As a strange coincidence, it is, we are recording on April 20th, 2020. Oil, for the first time ever, has settled at a negative value. So I think we should get into the oil storage business instead of Patreon, because it could be like Occultae Veritatis or like Oil Cultae Veritatis or something. And we could like store a bunch of oil at like, what is it, like $35 a barrel or whatever they're charging for it.
Yeah, we can.
You've been waiting all day to bust out that Oil Veritatis show.
No, I just thought of it on the fly, actually.
Whatever.
We can store it in garbage cans by the freeway. That'll be great.
All right, so how about we just cut to the poison?
So, what's your poison?
So, what's your poison?
What is the poison?
Alrighty, thanks to my resourceful housemates, I have lots of marijuana-themed poisons today to consume during the recording. I think I'm going to be smoking, first off, though, some train wreck bud.
Sounds about right. JK, 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 I love you. Okay, well, I am drinking some G-Dub Snur, also known as Great Western Pilsner. It was the beer that was in my fridge. Thank you, Mr. Sage Murray. And it's delicious.
I was going to ask if it originated from that beer company with 16 founders, but that's fucking 016, so...
No, it's the same.
But
It's the same.
Is it?
Yes?
Oh, well, goddamn.
Yeah, it's their less than premium line, I guess.
It's their Pilsner. It's been around, like, it's what we drank, like, in university.
I don't know. Pilsners will always have a special place in my heart as, like, cheap college swill, you know?
Yeah. This is the swilliest of the Saskatchewan swill is G-Dub Snur.
I made homemade pizza, I guess, earlier. It was full of mushrooms and like pineapple, and I had a whole bunch of like shredded cheese in the fridge and some like, I don't know. I mean, old but still smelled all right deli meats. So it was pretty good. It was a nice, thick, hefty pizza. I certainly wouldn't want it to come flying at my windshield if I were on the freeway. It was very salty.
Oh Jesus!
As opposed to normally when you want pizza thrown at your windshield in the freeway.
Exactly.
I recently had, like, pizza, like store-bought pizza, like frozen pizza, except it had, like, fancy, like, so fancy there's mold growing on the outside pepperoni. Like, added to the pizza.
How is that fancy?
It is, apparently. That's a thing.
It's super fancy. I can't remember the name of it, but it's the meat that always makes me think it's a cheese.
Cheese meat.
Well, it sounds like the name sounds like a cheese name. But it's not a meat name.
This all is making me throw up in my mouth. I hate this whole conversation.
You don't like fancy meats and or cheeses?
I don't like mold meat fanciness.
Do you like brie?
I like brie.
Yeah, brie's covered in mold.
Well, that's fine. But meat that's covered in mold that has a cheese name is not fine.
Do you not like salami? It also has mold on the outside of it.
Stop saying I don't eat meat.
Oh,
so no, I don't like that.
Fine, don't like salami.
I don't.
Are you sick?
I'm a big fan of prosciutto. That's a good meat.
Oh yeah.
Love that prosciutto.
My husband loves prosciutto as well.
I don't know. A little mold adds a nice citrusy flavor, I think.
Citrusy?
Adolf Hitler was a fanatical leader, a megalomaniac who led his country and many others into the abyss.
Some historians believe that Adolf Hitler thought that his mission in life was to rid the world of Jews. That even if he didn't build the Third Reich for 1,000 years, he would be celebrating for eliminating the Jewish population from the world. I don't know how you begin to deal with that kind of madness, but that's who he was.
So my episode here is sort of a what-if episode, you know. Basically, I'll just give you some background here. Adolf Hitler, born April 20th, 1889. So that is 131 years ago. Yes, boo Hitler. He was born in a town in Austria-Hungary, which is now, I guess, modern-day Austria. Lived his life until suicide on April 30th, 1945, a few days after his 56th birthday. In his younger years, he wanted to be an artist, and in 1914, when he was 25, he enlisted in the Bavarian army to fight in World War I, and then later entered into politics, which resulted in World War II and subsequent events from this. Now, this episode is sort of a little bit different. It's kind of a thought experiment rather than facts, you know, like, you know, you can kind of imagine things with what you know and then just kind of work with them from there. So I was kind of inspired to do this like thought experiment episode after that War Plan Red OV Pod episode. You know, it's where you like take known facts and like build hypothetical scenarios and just kind of see how they play it out.
Oh yeah, what if we went to war with America? But yeah, it's yeah, I like it.
Yeah, you just kind of take knowns and you just kind of work with them. So the common, I guess there's a trope of always kind of like going back in time to kill or dick around with Adolf Hitler and alter the timeline. This isn't kind of a new plan. It's always kind of been brought up in all sorts of different media, like anime, comic books, film, like in Deadpool 2 at the end credits, he goes back in time to kill Hitler. Yep. And sci-fi, like Star Trek, the series Star Trek Enterprise, there was a storyline about aliens that went back in time and they gave Hitler like advanced technology so he could attack North America and stuff like that. You know, so I mean, the going back in time and getting involved with Hitler in one way or the other is not new.
Oh yeah,
books
like Doctor Who literally has an episode called "Let's Kill Hitler."
Thank you, whoever you are. I think you have just saved my life.
Believe me, it was an accident.
What is this thing?
What did you mean we just saved his life? We could not have just saved Hitler.
You see, time travel. It never goes to plan. This box, what is it?
It's a police telephone box from London, England. That's right, Adolf. The British are coming.
Mm-hmm. Actually, what was it? There was a Doctor Who episode, Genesis of the Daleks, and it sort of talks about that, where the Doctor contemplates the future if he eliminates the Daleks from time.
Ooh.
You know, like he's sitting there at like the first Dalek and is ready, you know, he's like ready to like put two wires together and blow up the whatever it was that they were, you know, what brought them into being. And he's like, you know, if I blow this up, like, I erase the Daleks from history. And, you know, and he ultimately decides not to. Like, he feels that it was, you know, too much power for him to, you know, to create like this temporal genocide.
Yeah.
So the first killing Hitler time travel story was actually written in July of 1941. It was published in a pulp fiction magazine called Weird Tales under the name of Ralph Milne Farley. I guess for the sake of time frame, this story from July 1941 was published 5 months before Pearl Harbor happened.
Oh, geez.
So like this was actually written before the U.S. was in the war, and it was a time travel story about going back in time and killing Hitler. It was also kind of a political point as well a few years ago. When asked if he would go back in time to kill baby Hitler, Republican candidate, now Antifa leader, Jeb Bush.
Please clap.
I'm joking about the Antifa leader. Jeb. And he answers, and I quote,
clap.
You wait, 2020 is Jeb's year, man.
I hope so.
When asked if he'd go back in time to kill Hitler, and I quote, "Hell yeah, I would."
Oh, that's the kind of anti-fascism I like for my Republicans. I can put up with I can put up with a lot of Republican bullshit as long as they're anti-fascist. But come on now.
Right-wing media, I don't know, guy, podcaster Ben Shapiro at an anti-abortion March for Life said, and I quote, "The truth is no pro-life person would kill baby Hitler." Except I got to try it in like a Ben Shapiro voice. Like, the truth is no pro-life person would kill baby Hitler.
You see, there's no choice that pro-life people would kill Hitler. That's just a fact. You have to look it up, and facts over feelings up in here in the Ben Shapiro zone.
Yeah, that's right. Facts don't care about your feelings.
Facts over feelings.
So according to Ben Shapiro, no pro-life person would kill baby Hitler.
Ben Carson agrees with that one because when he was asked specifically about aborting baby Hitler, he's not in favor of aborting anyone. So,
in 2015, the question, could you kill baby Hitler, was posed by the New York Times with 42% of respondents saying yes. I think there was something like 30% who said no, and then the rest of them were like, I don't know.
I want a widespread demographic poll, like how many would kill toddler Hitler? How many people would kill angsty teen Hitler?
Toddler Hitler. Angsty teen Hitler is the name of my new punk band.
That would be pretty good. Every song is just called 9.
9!
Clean your room! 9!
So, let's do this. We will build an OV pod time machine. So now in post-production, you can add some TARDIS noises. And then I will say... That's not a TARDIS. Or maybe it would be more like, and then now in post-production, you can add some DeLorean noises.
Yeah.
And then I'll be like, nah, let's be honest. OV Pod Time Machine would be more like Bill and Ted. And now you can insert the Bill and Ted phone booth noises.
Oh, I hate that part.
Bill, what? Strange things are afoot at the Circle K.
Beautiful.
Because I think that's probably more what it would be like, than anything else. But,
yeah.
So we travel back to 1889 at 131 years ago, and now we have just ended baby Hitler.
Nice.
That's a lot of power for a single podcast, I think.
It is. But you know what? With great power comes great responsibility, and I think we're all ready.
And I think we would refuse to use it responsibly too. So.
Yeah.
Fair.
That's true.
How do we do it? Like we all pop into little baby Hitler's nursery. We got what we have on us right now. How do we do it?
Smother him with his own pillow.
Never really thought about the how.
Yeah.
I just
gotta smother him.
Yeah,
no,
I think
smother him.
Smother would probably be it. It would painless and quiet and everything else. I think. Yeah.
Grab.
And it's not like you're like. Yeah, you don't have to slit his throat or anything. Like that's a little bit excessive. But I think smother him with a pillow, Yeah.
You're not gonna grab him by his tiny little Hitler foot and toss him out the window?
No.
The first defenestration of whatever the place is that Hitler came from.
Yeah. That's what I was saying. Like as satisfying as it might be to dropkick baby Hitler, that's gonna create a lot of noise. Like his wet nurse and his mother are gonna be suspicious.
So, to kind of get an idea of what's how everything kind of built up with into the Second World War and the rise of the Nazi Party, it's important to note that after the First World War, Germany was in like massive economic crisis. The Treaty of Versailles, basically, when the war ended, caused the German citizens to really take the brunt of a lot of shit, really. They felt it was unfair, and every time that Germany wanted to try to have the terms of the treaty changed, they were basically met with a threat of, well, we will impose a starvation blockade on you, and we will continue, the war. And so basically, the only way that Germany could have had peace would be to basically sign and agree to whatever the terms were basically handed to them by this treaty. Otherwise, the other side would impose a starvation blockade and continue attacks on Germany. And basically, that was the end of it for them. So they couldn't do anything to get out of this. The military commanders basically said to the government officials, we need to sign this because there is absolutely no way in hell that we would be able to survive, the alternatives. So as a result, Germany lost over 13% of its territories, which basically left 7 million German citizens living under a foreign government.
Christ.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so they, as part of these terms, now suddenly these 7 million German citizens are now living under a foreign government that was just signed away as part of this treaty. So the German state was basically blamed entirely for the war, and reparations were sought by other countries involved. So the Germans were required to pay 132 billion marks, which converted to money at that time would be 33 billion US dollars, which if you adjust that for inflation to today's dollar, that is like $400 billion in today's money. So like the entire Canadian government's revenue for a single year is like 338 billion. So that's like all of Canada's revenue in a single year and then some. It's 400 billion, it's a big number, but like to try to conceptualize it is really hard. Like it would be like a government being like the U.S. government would have to, if this was imposed on, say, the U.S., it would be like the U.S. government having to come up with $1.2 billion per every American citizen today.
Christ.
Like I guess that's probably the easiest way to think of it is 1.2 billion per American citizen. If this had happened today and instead of Germany, it was the U.S. And that was basically what happened. They also had military had capacity restrictions imposed in it. So like they could only have so many ships, only have so many troops. They were prohibited from using like certain equipment as well. And so like this wasn't just like a military defeat, but it was like a psychological defeat on the population as well. So like Germany's just in a really, really bad shape right now. And so this is sort of what sets the stage to Hitler's rise in power, because like Hitler, when he learned of the surrender, like lost his shit. He learned of the surrender in November of 1918. And then basically felt that the German army, which he felt was, quote, undefeated in the field, had been, quote, stabbed in the back at home by civilian leadership, the Jews, the Marxists, and those who signed the armistice.
Oh, boy.
And so it's a thing. So, like, the stabbed in the back thing wasn't just, like, Hitler himself thinking this. Like, this was a big myth that propagated right-wing circles in Germany at the time. I don't know, like it seems to be a thing with right wingers where, like myths and like detached from reality and, not being able to see the broader picture seems to be kind of a thing for any time period, I guess. But yeah, the stabbed in the back myth was a very popular myth amongst right-wing circles in Germany at the time after the war.
And Christ, it's disappointing to see over 100 years later, like fascists and proto-fascists using the exact same lines and rhetoric. They're still blaming the Marxists. They're still blaming the Jews. Like they've been playing the same drum for over 100 years. And like even from like the birth of fascism and all that, like it's so silly. Like the Antifa thing, them blaming the Marxists and stuff like that, and then the anti-Semitism, them blaming the Jews. It goes right from the start.
Well, and blaming Jews is something that's happened forever, because even the idea of like the money-hungry, greedy Jew comes from the fact that governments all over the world made Jews do all of the money work and then took all their money and put them in ghettos when they got too rich.
Yeah. And I think that was because a lot of the governments in the time were Christian or Catholic in function, and by the laws of the time or by the religious beliefs of the time, Catholics don't loan or pay interest on loans. So they got the Jewish people to do that.
Yeah, so anyway, Hitler blames Jews for the states of things, and he ends up, as part of his military service, he was assigned to infiltrate the German Workers' Party, which then later became the National Socialist Party, or the National he infiltrates the German Workers' Party, which becomes the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And if you think they're socialist because it's in the name, you are going to shit a brick when you learn about urinal cakes and buffalo wings. Anyway, eventually he rises to power through an election on November 6th, 1932, with 33% of the people voting for him, and then history is set in motion. But because Sage just smothered baby Hitler after we traveled back in time, this does not happen. So for this purpose, I will kind of disregard questions about time travel, such as paradoxes, functionality of time travel, questions as the nature of time, because all of those would be like an episode in and of itself. Yeah. So I'm also going to try to like avoid, moral and philosophical questions around this. Is like, we really don't know in absolute terms what is right or what is wrong. Maybe I'm a bit nihilist in that sense, but it's just sort of trying to figure out, what could have happened if there was no rise in the power.
Just like a practical thought experiment without like morals or science holding us back.
Exactly. No morals, no science. It's just OV pod.
Fuck yeah.
That's fair.
And so anyway, the general kill Hitler question is an interesting one. There's this assumption that if you kill Hitler, World War II won't happen, and all these lives are spared, and everything else will remain normal, and that the world should be better off. Overall, without having the Second World War and the Holocaust and everything else that had happened. But would it necessarily? Like, say after Adolf's deaths, his parents have another child. I'm sure they would have grief, but in the 1800s, children dying was really nothing new. Like 4 of Adolf's siblings had died in childhood out of illness or just shortly after birth. So, to have another child and raise it as they would have Adolf, could have led to, instead of everybody saying Adolf Hitler, they could have said like Johann or Stefan Hitler instead. It's possible that they would rise to power and basically lead into the Second World War again. But if we accept that timeline, there really wouldn't be much of an episode.
That's fair.
Let's say, for example, in the post-World War I destitution of Germany, we didn't have Hitler. People were poor, defeated, morale is low. Now, in our timeline, we have Adolf Hitler to fill that power vacuum. But, like, what if somebody else came along? And, like, what if they were a more effective fascist? Maybe they rose to power sooner. Maybe they could have prevented the scientific exodus of the 1930s, where like hundreds of scientists such as Albert Einstein fled the country, upon the rise of fascism. Instead of these fleeing scientists working against the Nazis, they remained for some reason and worked for them.
Empowered by them instead of
Yeah. So like, say this fascist, instead of battlefield war, they focused on like weapons and technological development until they could assure victory, and then declared war. Germany started its atomic weapons program in 1939, and the United States didn't start their program until 1942. So they were, several years earlier when they started trying to develop atomic weapons. The Americans didn't drop their first test bomb until July 16th, 1945. So, that development was like 3 years of development to create this atomic weapon. So anyway, if atomic weapons had first been developed by Germany under this, like, I guess, quote, better fascist or more effective fascist, and then paired that with, say, a mature rocketry program like the V2 rocket, but, better, they would have had a decisive advantage in the war against other nations who would still have been working on this.
Oh, that's such an interesting concept. Like, also because, like, Germany is famous for mobilizing behind the war effort so effectively, like putting their whole country basically behind the war. Like, the citizens, the businesses, the money systems, all that stuff. And having that geared towards, like, a more pragmatic thing, like a more technological direction, like, could really have cinched them the war.
Exactly. And what is actually kind of concerning about this to me is that it is probably one of the most probable of alternative timelines. Like, Hitler did not give birth to fascism or authoritarianism or anti-Semitism or any of those other conditions that were there to allow fascism to take charge. We already know that fascism was ready to be bred and brought into power. So Hitler, without Hitler in the picture, somebody else could have easily filled that with that kind of ideology. And I guess also notable is that, like, Hitler didn't do all this single-handed. There were a lot of people out there who supported what happened. There were people out there who helped and organized what happened during Hitler's control. You move one fascist out, another one moves in, and everyone carries on. The Goebbels of the world and the Himmlers would still be around, even though we killed Hitler.
Yeah, if you listen to our fascist propaganda episodes, I explained kind of on the start of them. Also the Nazis and occultism episodes, kind of how those ideologies, like, started in the early 1600s and started developing throughout time, and they were co-opted by many figures, and Hitler kind of fell under the influence of some of these figures and, like, was educated by them, and then he amplified the education that he was given. So yeah, I think it could have easily fallen on another character, because all those philosophers and thought leaders and fascist teachers that put all those, like, fascist ideologies into young Hitler could have been put into somebody else quite easily as well.
I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess if you look at this power vacuum, let's say, instead of another fascist, say a leader rose out of a different ideology. Ernst Thälmann had received 16.86% of the vote in that November 6th election. He was the leader of the Communist Party of Germany, and basically eventually died in 1944 at the Buchenwald concentration camp.
Buchenwald?
Yeah, Buchenwald, yeah.
I can hear the drool leaking from the lips of tankies everywhere when they think of, like, an authoritarian powered communist Germany. Christ.
In 1932, in response to the situations that were arising, Thälmann had established Antifaschistische Aktion, which I guess can be shortened to Antifa. So, like Hitler, Ernst Thälmann had also fought in the First World War. In the March 1932 election, they actually used the slogan, "A vote for Hindenburg is a vote for Hitler. A vote for Hitler is a vote for war."
Christ.
So anyway, the Nazis come to power in 1933, and he proposed organizing a general strike in an effort to topple Hitler. So, every worker puts their tools down, doesn't go to work, and just shuts the economy down in an effort to force the governments, to have to, support the worker. So what if he had come to power? Now, I really won't want to focus on the how he came to power, be it electoral politics or military coup or proletarian revolution. I guess the fact is he came to power. It wakes up one morning and, he was the person in charge. I guess, I mean, kind of my thoughts are like if he had come to power through electoral politics, my thoughts are that the timeline probably would have played out very similar with the Nazi Party, still rising to power, because they would just say, well, we don't support your government. We're just going to take our paramilitary wing and start marching on the streets with them and, doing what they do to try to topple the government.
Yeah, the Night of Long Knives, Part 2.
And so as we get into 1934, Hitler is eager to eliminate more of his opponents. And we're not just talking about opponents outside of the Nazi Party. We're also talking about rivals within the Nazi Party. And so in 1934, June 30th in particular, or we could say June 30th to July 2nd, you have what's called the Night of the Long Knives. And it really should be called the Knights of the Long Knives. But the Night of the Long Knives, where under the pretext of a supposed coup d'état or putsch on the part of Ernst Röhm, you have the SS and the Gestapo starts rounding up Röhm, his allies, and any perceived enemies of Hitler, starts rounding them off and eliminating them and shooting them. Ernst Röhm is arrested, and when he refuses to kill himself in his jail cell, he is shot at point-blank range. Gregor Strasser, who is a former rival of Hitler within the Nazi Party, he is eliminated. Kurt von Schleicher, who is a previous chancellor of Germany, perceived as a rival to Hitler, he and his wife are gunned down. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who is in no way anymore a rival to Hitler, but he was one of the major actors for putting down the beer hall putsch, the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. He is hacked. He is hacked to get death. And these are just four of the more notable folks. On those few nights, over 85 major officials in Germany were eliminated.
Exactly. Like they would have just gone ahead with that anyway. Had the electoral, system, had produced a different result anyway. So anyway, Ernst was a supporter of Stalin. However, I do not think that a German communism would have looked a whole lot like Soviet communism. Because Soviet communism was like trying to transform like a largely agrarian society into an industrial society. Germany was already very industrialized by this point. So I think any sort of like revolution, bringing a communist leader or a Stalinist leader into power in Germany would have probably been perhaps a little less brutal in terms of reforms, just because they were, Germany had already been a fairly industrial country. Germany was also a lot more literate and a lot more educated compared to like Russia after the revolution. Pre-revolution Russia had like a 38% male literacy rate and a 12% female literacy rate before the revolution in Russia.
I mean, when all you're doing is aggregate farming, you really don't need to know how to read or anything like that.
Exactly. Whereas by that time, parts of Germany had compulsory education up to the age of 14, and they had compulsory education since 1825.
Christ. Wow.
So, like, 100 years earlier, they had decided that, certain parts it said that you have to stay in school till at least the age of 14. So, the German population was very well educated and they were very literate. And so I think in terms of quality of life for the average person in a post-communist revolution Germany when compared to a post-communist USSR would have been, a lot better, I think. But I guess in terms of a German communist leader instead of a German fascist leader, it's kind of like, well, what would that mean for the Cold War, and would there have even been one?
Yeah, would they have taken taken Poland? Would they have thought that if Germany must be mighty, we must obtain more land because the mighty countries have so much land to control over? Like that seemed to be a very Hitler-focused thought. Like Hitler says in Mein Kampf, for Germany to be truly great, we must obtain more land, because land translates into resources, blah, 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 blah. I wonder if the communist leader would have thought the same.
Well, and kind of my thoughts are, what it could have meant for workers around the world. Like, I mean, it wasn't just Germany that was, in the shit economically. Like, there was a lot of trouble everywhere else in the world. And, so like my thoughts are like, perhaps if there was a worker revolution in Germany, which brought, into a good, stable, power would be a communist leader. I'm thinking that perhaps like workers inspired by the results in Germany would have been inspired elsewhere. So maybe North American workers, may have launched their own revolutions. Perhaps. Yeah,
I think it depends too on their brand of socialism too, right? Because there's the idea of permanent revolution by some socialist thought leaders, and there's other ideas, Maoism and Stalinism and all kinds of things. So if Germany and Russia sort of came together as a great power that way, then there still may have been a Cold War, depending on how McCarthy went and everything else.
Mm-hmm. But
that's true, yeah.
Well, and I'm just kind of looking back at like 1935, so like a couple of years after Hitler had come to power, was basically you had like the On to Ottawa Trek, which was organized by workers in Canada, and the government at the time and the prime minister at the time had legitimate fear, and perhaps it was real. Perhaps it could have happened. Who knows? It didn't happen. But, they were afraid of a full-on revolution out of these, like, 1,000 workers who were, hitching a train to Ottawa. And, basically they ended up, like, subduing the workers in Regina, in a massive riot, and a bunch of people got killed as a result of it. But, perhaps, instead of 1,000 workers, maybe it was 10,000 workers, who decided to join. Or whatever, and maybe it could have reached like a critical mass, and perhaps, so if there was, more, I guess, some sort of like communist order in, in all the various superpowers, would there necessarily have been a Cold War? Of course, it's all like just supposition and guessing and whatever, but
yeah.
What's your thoughts?
I don't know, like, there's a few things, like, Germany wanted to develop the nuclear bomb because it thought that that's its way it could be equal to other countries. That was another belief of not only Hitler's, but all his war generals. So I think that would have gone forward. I still think they would have pursued the nuclear bomb. Because a lot of the war generals and thought leaders in Germany still wanted the nuclear bomb. And they were using similar philosophies that other countries were. That we might not ever need to fire this, but having it is better than not having it, because if you don't have it, then you're an open target. You can't fire back, kind of thing. And something else that occurs to me is Hitler was one of the people that, well, it's disputed whether he totally bought into it, or he played along with it, or he just simply saw value in it. But he dedicated millions of German marks and time and effort of his generals and war effort into studying occult issues, buying castles and refurbishing them, and having rituals done, flying SS officers in to do these occult rituals. Like, he had some kind of belief in these otherworld magic things. And I wonder if any of that would have carried forward, because Hitler definitely either believed or tolerated or saw value in it. But, like, did those that surround him have that, like, focus as well? And would they have passed it on to whoever came to power next? Would Germany still be obsessed with, like, finding, like, a supernatural or occult key to become powerful?
I'm not sure. Like, I mean, I didn't really look with an eye to the occult on this one, but I mean, perhaps. I don't know if Ernst Thälmann would have, was very into the occult. I didn't really find anything about that. I mean, not that I looked terribly hard, but maybe.
Maybe.
In terms of, I guess, how things would play out for the Jewish population in Germany, if Ernst had risen to power instead. I'm not really sure it would have played out terribly better for them. I mean, maybe there wouldn't have been camps, but there may have been exiles or executions and similar things like that. Because I mean, anti-Semitism, certainly wasn't an idea born by Hitler, and I think it was one of the primary, or was a pretty prevalent belief at the time as well. With a lot of Jewish people being portrayed as, like capitalists, or capitalists being portrayed as Jews. So I don't imagine that it would be any sort of paradise for the Jewish population had there been a communist leader rise up instead of Hitler. What if the avoiding of the Second World War did happen? What if like a moderate had somehow risen to power in those tough times, and slowly, steadily implemented incremental change and no drastic, things, avoiding the war, at least for time being. Without the Second World War, I'm curious what that would mean in terms of tensions between the Soviet and American governments. Would they continue to escalate, without the war to provide a distraction from that? Could it?
I don't think so. Well,
you don't think?
No, I don't think so, because I think that a lot of the tensions between the U.S. and like the Soviet states arose from the Second World War.
You think so?
I think so.
Okay. What do you think, Arthur?
I just told you what I think. Okay, Arthur, tell us.
Well, yeah, I like if memory serves, like the U.S. and USSR worked together, probably not in the nicest way forever, but they worked together during the Second World War to take out the Nazis. And it was just afterwards when, well, now we all have these nukes and there's these two ideologies that are so, opposite to each other. I guess we're going to have this Cold War. So again, the same idea is like if they didn't have, someone to come together against, then would they have just continued to have been like, if, communism continues to grow in Russia, capitalism continues to grow in the States, would there still be a Cold War? I'm answering questions with more questions like a proper politician.
Yeah, you are.
It's like that game on the Whose Line Is It Anyway, where you answer a question with a question. Exactly.
We can't underestimate, like, the hunger for war that, like, peacetime militaries have. Like, researching my Wartime Red episode, I found that so many countries had come up with hypothetical attack plans against so many other countries during peacetimes. Like, they would do, like, on-the-ground research and dedicate resources and time and write up these giant reports about, if we went to war with country X, here's exactly what we would do. And it's documents just like that can be slapped on the table of a politician when tensions are tough and said, we already have a plan, like, on the line, we're ready to go, we just need to implement it. You just need to sign the papers and we can carry this forward. Like, that's how wars have started all the time, through, like, papers and plans like that. So I think that tensions would have continued to rise, especially with nuclear weapons coming into the fold, until some tension broke. And I think something similar would have happened, where all the different countries would have, gained alliance with one another and chosen sides, and then you have another world war again.
I think historically, too, countries needed militaries because they had enemies on all sides, and borders were a lot less stable as they are today, stable as they are. But there's also talk about, keep your army happy, keep your army from getting bored, because a bored army does things like, cross into Rome and take over and install Julius Caesar as their new emperor instead of all that.
Well, according to the, for World War II, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, there had been 8.6 million military deaths throughout the war. So, just, I guess, over 8.5 million people had, or soldiers had died in the war. So, without these deaths, Russia would have, certainly been in a much stronger military position, had they not happened, kind of faced, against conflict with the other superpower of the United States. By the end of World War II as well, the U.S. was half the world's industrial capacity. So, I mean, had there not been this war, would the U.S. have been half of the world's industrial capacity at the time? I'm not sure. If they didn't have a war to ramp up production, would they have?
Just to give some perspective for how much Russia sacrificed, because I think that's a fantastic point, that Russia would have been a lot more militarily mighty. In World War II, United States lost 416,000. A lot of people. The United Kingdom lost 383,000. A whole bunch of people. Guess how many the Soviet Union lost? 10,700,000 people in military conflict.
Wow.
They lost, basically, how did this country that just recently became industrialized, how did they fare against a fully industrialized Germany? They did it by throwing troops against the German meat grinder until the meat grinder plugged with Russian corpses. That's how they did it.
Yeah, so that leads to the question, would an industrially weaker United States be able to stand up to a militarily stronger Soviet Union?
With millions of troops to spare, literally millions.
Well, and when you think about it in terms of, the atomic bomb may or may not have been invented by that point.
Oh, no kidding.
So yeah, I guess the question is kind of how devastating could a war, instead of a Second World War, if we had a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, that Cold War heated up, without a Second World War to kind of put a dampener on things, without the immediate, availability of nuclear weapons, would they have developed these weapons had it not been for the Nazis starting a nuclear program in 1939? Would they have developed? Would the United States and the Soviet Union have developed the atomic weapons? While they were at war with each other, or would one side have even actually used one against the other? Would the Americans have bombed the USSR if? Had we not had Hiroshima and Nagasaki to hold up as an example of, what atomic weapons can do, would they have actually, would one side have used it against each other in this hypothetical, hot war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? Would one side have maybe just, suddenly we have a successful atomic bomb test, and now would the other side have immediately surrendered? You've done it. You can annihilate us, and so we are now going to discuss terms of surrender. What would that have happened instead? The mutually assured destruction of both the USSR and the USA is what kind of kept the Cold War cold. This fear of nuclear war, and the fact that if you start it, the other side's going to be able to respond in same, and basically there's going to be a whole lot of lot of devastation.
Sometime we have to have an episode about all the times they almost pressed the button but didn't.
For decades, men in bunkers watched their screens and warning lights every hour of every day, waiting for the Cold War to go nuclear. So too was the situation just after midnight on September the 26th, 1983. Stanislav Petrov was the lieutenant colonel in charge of the Soviet Union's early warning radar system in a bunker near Moscow. Then, it happened.
When I first saw the alert message, I got up from my chair. All my subordinates were confused. So I started shouting orders at them to avoid panic. I knew my decision would have a lot of consequences.
The radar was showing a single missile inbound from the United States. Now the race was on. Was it real or a computer error? His boss accepted over the phone it was a likely fault. But as soon as he hung up...
The siren went off for a second time. Giant blood-red letters appeared on our main screen, saying "Start." It said that 4 more missiles had been launched.
To Petrov, it didn't add up. Any attack by the US would have been all out to try and cripple a Soviet response. But if they were real, he had only 30 minutes to tell his superiors before the warheads hit.
My cozy armchair felt like a red-hot frying pan, and my legs went limp. I felt like I couldn't even stand up. That's how nervous I was when I was taking this decision.
Petrov stuck to his decision, broke Soviet military rules by not telling his superiors, and was proved right. There were no missiles. He never had the authority to press the button himself, but how close had the world come to nuclear war?
At that time, it seemed that our country was surrounded by enemies, but was strong enough to retaliate. The Soviet Union and the USA were too strong, and both our countries had too many conflicts of interest in various parts of the world.
For Petrov, the answer is more simple.
We've never been as close to a nuclear war, neither before nor later on. It was the very climax.
Petrov broke military doctrine, but possibly saved the world. He has since been given an award by the Association of World Citizens and honoured by the UN. He says he's not a hero and was just doing his job.
So I don't know, but like, weren't Khrushchev and Kennedy like pretty buddy-buddy during this whole thing?
I would say so, but were they buddy-buddy because they allied against the Nazis? If the Nazis weren't as prominent, would they have been so buddy-buddy?
Well,
I don't know, but like, it was... Sorry, go ahead.
Think about how quickly the Cold War arguably got started, because Korea started in 1950, which was, you know, not like, it's not like it was 20 years after the World War II that there was suddenly a proxy war between communist and capitalist forces. Like, it's 5 years after. So I think they were itching to fight and found the first excuse to after the Second World War, which was Korea in our timeline.
Yeah. Well, my other thoughts are, you know, say that nuclear arms against the population, you know, wouldn't have signaled the end of like this hot war between the U.S. and the USSR. Maybe it could have signaled the beginning of one. You know, suddenly we have a bomb, and while we're not full, you know, while we aren't, you know, in combat, well, now suddenly we have a bomb, and let's use it. You know, is kind of the thoughts. You know,
I think how military generals communicate to politicians is, we have some opportunity here to gain some things. We have all this momentum built up in the military sector, and we can use it to gain something, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Opportunity.
I guess that's kind of a depressing thought to think of, you know, a nuclear war happening, you know, as a result of no World War II. I guess it's kind of, it could have happened, you know, like it wasn't, you know, the major players didn't become, you know, like Germany and the Allies. It, you know, became US and the USSR instead.
And here's another question. If World War II would have never happened, and like a lot of countries around the world weren't like energized into throwing a whole shitload of money behind like science and engineering to catch up to the world, to like the war technology, would we have ever gotten to the moon in 1969?
And that's the next part of my episode.
Ooh.
Yeah,
nice.
Good segue, man. That was awesome.
15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
So, with combat comes innovation. So there had been obviously a number of technological advancements and designs. You know, as you've mentioned, you know, the rocket program came out of German scientists assisting Americans, you know, developing a space program. You know, the physicists fleeing Germany helped work on a nuclear weapons program in other countries. You know, without these, you know, without the war, would these technologies have existed? You know, would they have developed quickly, or would they have even developed at all? Would they have taken decades longer to develop without the additional push of urgency of conflict, you know. So some other interesting things that come out of World War II instead of, you know, in addition to, I guess, the rocket program, which led to the space program, and the nuclear weapons program, which led to nuclear power. For example, now this is a very simple one. This is the jerry can. Yeah, the jerry can came out of World War II. I'm not really talking the modern day plastic version that you buy at like Canadian Tire, but like the really good solid metal one. You know, they got 3 handles, so like you could carry 1 or 2 of them, you know, in each hand if they were empty. You know, they've got additional handles on them so that, like, you know, if you had a human chain to like move goods and products and whatever, you know, you can pass one jerry can off to the next person because they'll have their own handle that they can grab, and then swing it off to the next person who'll have a handle who can grab it. You know, so there are 3 handles on these cans to allow a higher efficiency in it, in, you know, deploying, you know, fuel. There was also a lever release mechanism that allowed easier pouring, and that was an invention, I guess, or development that came out of Nazi Germany during the war. The other thing is some pretty interesting things that happened with regards to developments in aviation. High altitude flight was very dangerous prior to the war because there was like low oxygen levels up in the higher atmosphere. So it basically put pilots at risk of passing out or even having death. You know, they could suffer trauma as a result of pressure differences inside of the body compared to the air pressure outside the body at high altitudes. So they would basically give pilots an oxygen mask, which had been known to fail. And if you've got to like carry this oxygen mask with you and everything, you know, it really makes it difficult for you to move around the aircraft, you know, if you have to breathe through this mask. So what happened was they developed pressurized cabins, which is now used in commercial passenger aircraft. So, you know, the whole cabin is pressured at a, you know, normal atmosphere level, making it, in addition to being safer, it was also more comfortable for people at flights at higher altitudes. I mean, imagine, you know, in addition to all the other shit you have to put up with when you go flying somewhere, imagine having to wear an oxygen mask as well. You know, in addition to the guy in front of you leaning his fucking seat back right into your lap, you know.
And if we're wearing a mask, they sure as hell wouldn't serve us peanuts anymore. And that's the only thing that brings me joy in the flight. Yeah.
No, maybe Air Canada will listen to this episode, and then oxygen masks will be their next cost-cutting feature. You know, if you got to pay an extra $150 for a pressurized cabin. I don't know.
See, I've already solved your peanut issue though, because all you do is you hook up the same oxygen, like the air supply and the peanut supply together. So you just get a little bell that rings, and all of a sudden,
wonderful,
boom, peanuts.
Peanuts
just flies into your mouth.
Yeah,
I'm ready.
Whether you're ready or not.
Random peanuts.
Other
peanuts in your mouth, bitch.
Other aircraft related inventions included a radio-based navigation system and landing system. So basically, prior to the war, there wasn't much in the way of technology with regards to navigation. So like a lot of missions were done by sight. But that made it very shitty to do bombing operations at night, you know, because you can't see if you're over your target. Mm-hmm. So basically what was developed was a radio navigation where these base stations would send out radio blips, and then instruments in the aircrafts would use the time between receiving each of these blips to figure out where you are. So it's very similar to GPS, you know. And so initially, because of this, they could only equip a few aircraft with it. So they would equip some aircraft with it, and then the aircraft with it would, you know, fly a mission, and then the rest of the bomber squadron would be flying with them. And then when they got to where the target was, the lead aircraft would drop flares because they knew where they were and where the target was. And so after dropping flares, the rest of the bombers knew where to bomb and use that as a reference point. And so also like GPS, it didn't need any sort of transmission back. So bombers could conduct operations just listening to these blips instead of having to communicate back to any sort of home base. Because if you have a communication back to the home base, well, then, the Germans would know, oh, there's a bombing, mission incoming, and, alerts the enemy, and they can work with this. So basically from this like ground-based radio navigation system came the longer range LORAN navigation system, and then the VOR navigation system, and now GPS, which is like super precise and worldwide, and you can know where you are at any point, and everybody has one in their pocket now. So it's kind of like, well, if we killed Hitler and World War II didn't happen, would this have developed? Would passenger aircraft flight be as prevalent as it is today? Would I ever be able to track skip the dishes without GPS? That's, that kind of thing. Also, the jet engine was also made popular as well, which, near the end of the war, allowing for faster travel, for aircraft.
And I think the jet engine was really developed to outrun the nuclear bombs they were going to drop.
Well, the jet engine, I believe, was pushed by an inventor back in 1938. And at the time, the British government really didn't give two shits about it. And so they really didn't, so it didn't actually become popularized until closer to the end of the war. I think it was 44 or 45, when some of the fighters were starting to be equipped with jet engines, in place of the regular propeller engines. So, I mean, this kind of helped popularize the jet engine as well. Another thing that came out of war was radar. In 1935, the first radar tests were being done to see if radio waves could be used to detect incoming aircraft. So this gave the British the ability to warn people of incoming attacks and scramble some sort of defense if something's coming in that no one's really expecting, and you see it show up on the radar because they're bouncing radio waves back at you. So anyway, as the technology developed, they created a better, more accurate microwave radio transmitter. So it was smaller than the original radar system. And it was so small they could actually load these into planes. And then it was so accurate that it could actually identify a U-boat's periscope sticking out of water.
Wow.
So you're flying over some ocean and suddenly you got a blip on your radar, and it's your microwave bounces off of the periscope, and now you can see it just sticking out of the ocean. I think that's kind of interesting precision.
Do you know what else came out of radar?
The microwave.
The microwave.
Yes.
You're talking about that one too?
Yep, this, well, that's what I was saying, is this microwave radio transmitter in peacetime was then later used in microwave ovens in kitchens all over the world. And, not to mention the less popular police speed radar guns.
Oh man, so I have World War II to thank for not only 3-minute brownies, but speeding tickets. Complicated feelings.
Yeah, it's just torn, The next interesting thing that came out of it was penicillin. It was a wartime drug. While it was initially discovered before the war in 1928 as an antibiotic, most scientists just kind of disregarded it until 11 years later, when research showed a lot of potential. There was a lot of diseases that had no cures, like neonatal conjunctivitis, for example. And then they were doing some penicillin trials on it, and suddenly these things that were debilitating, horrible, bacterial diseases are now suddenly being cured for the first time ever. Scientists kind of started looking at this. One patient during the penicillin trials had a severe infection on his face consisting of Staphylococcus and Streptococcus. And so after the penicillin treatment, he started to improve and things started to heal and get better. But then he died when they ran out of penicillin to give him.
You've probably cut your finger at some point in your life. Painful, sure, but no big deal. Well, imagine if that minor cut became so infected with bacteria that it killed you. Before the 1940s, that really did happen, a lot. The most minor injuries could be deadly. And then a discovery was made that changed the world. Penicillin. It was discovered totally by accident. In 1928, Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming left his lab to go on vacation without cleaning up. When he came back, he found mold had developed on a contaminated sample of staphylococci. Remarkably, the mold had killed the surrounding bacteria. He decided to name the substance released from the mold penicillin. But what is penicillin exactly? It is an antibiotic that fights bacteria by stopping the cell wall from renewing during growth. This weakens the cell wall until it bursts, killing the bacteria.
It was showing like great success and great promise, and basically as a result of this, the United States in July of 1943, they had the War Production Board put up a plan for mass distribution of penicillin stocks to Allied troops in Europe, which basically led to the mass production of this drug for the first time ever. So like all these infections that people were dying from, we could now cure. And they were like, well, we need this for the war and for our troops overseas. So, allocate all the resources to make as much of this as we possibly can to, help everybody. And so otherwise, it's like, well, had the war not happened, would they have mass produced this drug? Would it be as readily available without this production? And, and then you kind of think, well, how many people could have died without treatment had this drug not be put into mass production?
We're kind of experiencing a bit of reality of that right now. I mean, the weight pandemics can hold if they're not treated with the right respect. I mean, Christ, who knows? Millions.
Exactly. So other interesting things is first computers also started arising out of the war in order to break German ciphers. The Lorenz machine actually used binary logic to break the German cipher. The creation of this machine basically led to the development of other machines, which would eventually lead to our modern-day computer. And it's like, well, without the war and having to break German ciphers, would they, this machine probably wouldn't have been built. And so the idea of, a machine to do all these complex calculations instead of a human, how long would it have taken for us to come along and make one? And, would it have delayed the development of like today's computer technology?
Was that the work of Alan Turing you're talking about?
I don't think Turing, I think, was the Enigma machine. I don't think the Lorenz machine was a Turing thing, but I could be wrong with that. But I believe Turing was the Enigma code, which, my understanding is that the Enigma code was basically like character substitution. So like instead of spelling the word the, THE, they would try to make cryptic by saying WDR. And basically, once you figured out what letters were substituting other letters, then you could use that to break the code. Whereas like Lorenz machine was a little bit more like today's cryptography, where there's a number of like logic, I'm going to say puzzles, that that you have to work through in order
like an A equals B, then C, and then D kind of thing.
Yeah, unless preceded by a W, and then you would have a P and an O and an L, which would then, unless this character over here was this, and and a lot more complicated of a cipher versus a simple character substitution cipher, which I believe the Enigma was, which is what Turing had cracked. But this
is all too complicated for me.
So basically understanding that there was a machine that could break this code through complex calculations, cause other people to realize this is possible, and then we can use this to build something else, which eventually becomes today's computers. So I guess, I don't know. So now we're back in time in Hitler's nursery, and it's like, well, would you kill baby Hitler,
You lose all this advancement, technology, a trip to the moon.
I don't know.
You also irreparably change the world, because to think of all the people that wouldn't have died and wouldn't have been born. Like, the world today would not be the same. Like, it reminds me of a movie called, I think, A Distant Thunder. That might be the name, but they step on like a butterfly or something stupid like that in the past, and that irreparably alters the future in horrific ways. And I just wonder what the true ripple effects are. Like, we talked about big picture, but like, if somebody's Aunt Marge wasn't blown up by like an errant artillery shell, like, what could have her death led to? All her ancestors would have been blown out. Like, what would that have led to? Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, it's the idea behind this. Like, I mean, that's kind of why I'm saying, well, you can't really put any sort of moral right or wrong in this kind of thing. Because, I mean, okay, so maybe one of Hitler's, victims turned out to be a great grandfather to somebody who is going to be 1,000 times worse. Like, you can't really, you wouldn't know. You don't know.
Or 1,000 times better.
Or 1,000 times better. Like you just,
this could be
really
the
don't
secret
know.
key to utopia, and we just don't know it.
Yeah, I mean, Adolf Hitler was, who Adolf Hitler was, but maybe Victor Hitler would have been the greatest humanitarian known to man.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, well, for Occultae Veritatis, I am Richard Bigley.
Gallifrey.
Sage Mary.
And our guest today,
Arthur Tallis.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Love you, bye.
Alrighty, playing us out this episode, we have Felix the Cat by Paul Whiteman and his orchestra. Yep, written all the way back in the beginning of the 19th century. Wait, no, 20th century. Fuck. Anyways, here's the song.
Underneath a pussy willow, Felix the
everyone, and welcome to the After Show. My name is Sage Murray, and today I will be reading an email that I got from a listener. Okay, so it says, "Hi Sade, Uj, Leon, and Richard. I absolutely love OV, and it's one of the only non-fiction podcasts I listen to that my brain doesn't tune out automatically. I love the respect that you approach topics with, and it's nice to find a podcast run by other people with mental health problems. I just listened to Sage's ASD episode, and as an autistic person, I had a few little nitpicks. I know Sage worked with a friend of hers, and it's really nice to hear that, because I've listened to other episodes on autism where the people didn't, and it was really shitty. I may have different opinions than Sage's friend. I think it's probably because of age/circles. I run in quite young 20s, 30s, Eurocentric online communities, and we may have differences in opinions to people outside of Europe. Anyway, a few notes on what Sage said first. High-low functioning, not really accepted by the autistic community anymore, especially because functionality can vary based on circumstances. I've had days where I can be very functional in the morning, but by the evening when I'm tired, I'm nonverbal and have to lie in a dark, quiet room under my weighted blanket. Since I've gotten my anxiety under control, my sensory problems have become a lot better, but if I'm having a panic attack, I'm likely to go into sensory shutdown afterwards. Personally, rather than a sliding scale of functioning, I see it more as a color wheel, with each symptom as a color, and each person experiences each symptom with differing intensity depending on their mood, the situation they're in, any number of variables. That's definitely a good point. Has versus is. Autistic advocates and the NAS, National Autistic Society, prefer identity-first language, autistic person, versus person with autism, as autism is intrinsic to who we are and cannot be separated from us. I know that healthcare services often use person-first language, like person with autism, to, in quotations, humanize us. But from the online autistic community's point of view, it's a pretty outdated way of referencing us. And I think it's important to put the voices of autistic people first. This also extends to the wider disabled community, where a lot of advocates prefer disabled person instead of person with a disability. Because for a lot of us, disability is part of who we are. I'd actually just learned about this, and I have been working to help switch my language. So more common in boys. It displays differently in AFAB people, as Sage mentioned, which leads to late or lack of diagnosis. It's still not technically untrue, but I think that the diagnosis rates will even out soonish as more assigned female at birth people get diagnosed. There's a surge of older women getting diagnosed recently, which is lovely that they can get that support. Absolutely. Stimming helps with comfort and anxiety, but also self-regulation of sensory input. Stimming can be physical motions, but also watching videos, playing games, singing songs, etc. There's even internal stimming, which can be repeating phrases in your head. It can be any form of self-soothing behavior. For instance, at work, I sing along to the radio so I can keep calm. And some other stuff you might find interesting. Autism in trans people. There's a higher percentage of trans people in the autistic community compared to in the all-istic, non-autistic population. It's not that being autistic makes you trans, it's that, in my opinion, we're more used to introspecting. Interesting. Additionally, we're already othered by society, so being othered in another way doesn't scare us as much. A really shitty thing in the UK at the moment is that if you're diagnosed as autistic, the NHS is very unlikely to let you start transition. What the fuck? So I have friends who are waiting to start transitioning before they can get an autism diagnosis that could really help them at university and in life in general. I'm officially diagnosed as autistic, so unless something changes soon, I'm unlikely to be allowed to transition on the NHS and would have to go private. That's some bullshit. Comorbidity. A lot of assigned female at birth autistic people have eating disorders and other comorbid disabilities. ADHD is also super comorbid with autism, as they're very similar to the point that they're called cousin disorders. The questionnaires for both have a lot of overlapping questions. And there's a growing thought that they aren't necessarily separate things, but different presentations of the same thing. Most of my autistic friends are also ADHD, and I'm very likely ADHD too, but I don't have the emotional bandwidth to try for a diagnosis yet. Oh, definitely. A terrible anecdote for you. I got put on antipsychotics, risperidone, straight up for my autism by an NHS psychiatrist, and the side effects made me so dysphoric and zombie-like. I kept disassociating. One of my friends had to walk me home because I almost walked into the road in a haze in front of them. After 2 days of that, I just quit them and discharged myself from the psychiatrist because I didn't trust her. If you look up risperidone, it literally says that it's used to treat irritability and autism. That's fucking insane. Thank you so much for being such lovely people and for making a podcast I truly enjoy. I might send you some Welsh beer at some point if I can figure out how to send it without bottles breaking en route, or some Pendrin whiskey, because that shit is good. Eli. Thank you so much, Eli, for taking the time to write this email. I do apologize for the mistakes that I made, and I love you, and I love everyone that's listening. So I hope everyone has a really, really awesome night, and stay safe and stay healthy. Okay, love you, bye.